I was 62 years old, standing in my kitchen in Warwick, England, holding a cup of tea that had gone cold, staring at a single page of a document I was never supposed to see, and I felt the floor dissolve beneath me. Not metaphorically, my legs actually gave way. I grabbed the counter edge and held on as 53 years of belief, service, sacrifice, and devotion crashed into one sentence printed in plain black ink. I had pioneered. I had knocked on doors in freezing rain and blistering July heat. I had missed my daughter's graduation ceremony because it fell on a circuit assembly weekend, and I had chosen Jehovah. I had sat across from my best friend of 30 years and told him with tears in my eyes that I could no longer associate with him because the elders had disfellowshipped him for a matter I never fully understood. I had done all of this because I believed, with every fiber of my being, that I was part of the only true organization on earth. And then I read that paragraph. It was buried inside the Elder's Handbook, a book the organization officially calls Shepherd the Flock of God, a manual that for decades was treated as so confidential that ordinary members were not permitted to read it, let alone own a copy. The elders in my congregation kept theirs locked away. I had seen one elder tuck his into a bag and zip it shut the moment a non-elder walked into the back room. We were told it contained sensitive guidance meant only for appointed men. What it actually contained was the proof that everything I had given my life to was constructed on a carefully managed lie, and the organization knew it, documented it, and had been protecting itself from it for years. My name is not important. What is important is that I am real. My story is real, and there are thousands of people sitting in kingdom halls right now, on hard chairs, under fluorescent lights, who are one paragraph away from having the same moment I had. If you were watching this and you were raised in the truth, or if you gave your adult years to it, as I did, I need you to stay with me through every chapter of this story. Because I am not going to attack your faith. I am not going to mock your family. I am going to tell you exactly what happened to one man over the course of a lifetime inside that organization, and I am going to let you decide what to do with it. I was baptized at 9 years old in a swimming pool in Birmingham. My parents were both witnesses. My grandparents on my mother's side had come into the truth in the 1950s during the wave of post-war conversions that swept through working-class England. As far back as I could remember, my entire world was the congregation. My friends were in the congregation. My holidays were assemblies. My education was shaped by the organization's counsel to avoid university because Armageddon was coming before the generation that saw 1914 would pass away. I believed that. I shaped every decision of my life around it. By the time I was in my late 50s, I was a ministerial servant, one step below elder, and I had been for nearly 2 decades. I had been passed over for elder several times. I told myself it was Jehovah's timing. I told myself I needed to be more spiritually mature, more exemplary, less questioning, because questions were the problem. I had always had questions, and I had always buried them, because you learn very quickly inside that organization that curiosity is not a virtue. Before I go any further, if this story is already touching something inside you, please subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment below telling me what city you are watching from. It matters to me to know that someone out there is hearing this. And if you know someone who needs to hear it, share it. Like the video. Do all the things the algorithm needs. Because the only reason I am telling this story is so that it reaches the person who is sitting exactly where I was sitting 3 years ago, confused, loyal, quietly breaking. The Kingdom Hall where I spent the first 30 years of my life as an active witness was a converted warehouse on Pratt Street in a Birmingham neighborhood that had seen better decades. The brothers had built it themselves. That was something the organization always emphasized with pride, the fact that we built our own places of worship with volunteer labor. My father had laid tile on that floor. I had painted the exterior wall at 13 years old, standing on a borrowed scaffold in October drizzle, and I had felt a deep and genuine sense of belonging. That hall was not just a building to me, it was the architecture of my identity. My father was what you would call a solid brother. He was not dramatic about his faith. He did not weep at assemblies or give tearful talks about Jehovah's love. He was quiet and consistent, and he conducted himself in a way that made me believe the truth was something you demonstrated through behavior rather than proclamation. He was a window cleaner by trade, and he witnessed informally to every customer he had. He was not appointed as an elder, but he was deeply respected, and when he spoke at the theocratic ministry school, the hall went quiet. My mother was different, warmer, more openly emotional about her faith. She was the one who sat with me as a child and went through the Paradise book, pointing to the illustrations of Ryans lying down beside children in the New World, and I had wanted that world with everything a child is capable of wanting. The pictures were extraordinary: peace, beauty, resurrection, dead loved ones coming back, no more war. I did not question those pictures. I absorbed them into the deepest part of myself. School was complicated. I attended a state school in Birmingham, where none of my classmates were witnesses. I did not salute the flag at any event. I did not stand for the national anthem on the occasions it was played. I did not participate in Christmas plays or Easter crafts. I had to explain this repeatedly to teachers and classmates alike, and the explanations were exhausting and isolating in ways I could not fully articulate until I was decades older. The teachers were generally tolerant. The other children were not always so. The social architecture inside the congregation, however, was rich and complete. There were always activities, always study groups, always the service on Saturday mornings followed by tea and toast at someone's flat. There was a social calendar that ran parallel to the world's calendar, assemblies in the spring, district conventions in the summer, the memorial of Christ's death every year in the spring, which was treated with more solemnity than any outside holiday. I never felt lonely inside that world. I felt chosen. By the time I was a teenager, I had fully internalized the boundary between the congregation and the world. That word, the world, was used in a very specific way. It meant everything outside Jehovah's organization. Worldly people were not necessarily evil, we were taught, but they were spiritually lost, and too much association with them could corrupt your values. I believed this. I monitored my own thoughts for worldly contamination. I reported myself to my parents when I felt attracted to ideas I had encountered in school. I was not unusual in this. Most young people raised in the truth did the same thing. What I did not understand then, and would not understand for another 40 years, was that this monitoring, this constant self-surveillance, was not a sign of spiritual health. It was a control mechanism. The organization did not need to police every member individually. It had trained each member to police themselves and to report deviations in others. The congregation functioned as a distributed surveillance network, held together not by fear, but by genuine devotion. We watched each other because we loved each other. That is the most sophisticated kind of control there is.
I married at 24. Her name was Constance. Connie, everyone called her. And she had grown up in a congregation in Coventry. We had met at a circuit assembly and had courted for 8 months with the appropriate oversight. Our entire social world was the congregation, so finding a partner within it was not a strategy. It was simply the only map we had. We loved each other sincerely, and I do not want anything I say here to be read as a dismissal of that love, because it was real and it was good, and it existed inside a framework that was also, I now understand, designed to keep us dependent on the organization for everything that mattered. We pioneered together for 2 years before our first son was born. Pioneering meant putting in at least 90 hours per month in the door-to-door ministry and related activities. Connie worked part-time as a seamstress. I did painting and decorating, scheduling my jobs around the ministry. We were not comfortable financially. We were not supposed to be. The organization taught that material ambition was a spiritual trap. Brothers who pursued careers were counseled gently but persistently to simplify their lives. I accepted this counsel completely, and when our son was born and we were struggling to cover the rent, I told myself it was a test of faith and that Jehovah would provide. Sometimes he did, in the form of a brother who quietly handed me an envelope of cash. Sometimes he did not, and we ate very little. My questions began not as doubts, but as logistical confusions that I took to the elders, expecting resolution. The first one that I remember clearly, the one that planted something in me that would not die for 40 years, was about 1975. If you were inside the organization in the early 1970s, you know what 1975 meant. The society had strongly indicated through publications and assembly talks that 1975 would likely mark the end of 6,000 years of human existence and the beginning of the 1,000-year reign of Christ. The language was carefully hedged, but the message was unmistakable. Armageddon was very possibly coming in 1975. Thousands of witnesses around the world sold their homes. Couples chose not to have children. Young people did not go to university because there was no point. My own parents delayed a home repair they desperately needed because they believed they would be in paradise before it became urgent. I was a teenager during those years, and the anticipation was electric. The end of the old world was not a threat, it was a promise, and we were ready for it. 1975 came and went. Armageddon did not arrive, and what happened afterward was one of the most revealing episodes in the organization's history, though I did not see it that way at the time. Many witnesses left. There was a significant drop in membership in the late 1970s. Those who stayed were told, eventually, that any expectations had been their own misreading of the society's guidance, a result of running ahead of Jehovah's organization. I accepted this explanation because the alternative, that the organization had been wrong and had not admitted it honestly, was not something I could hold in my mind without the entire structure collapsing. I was 27 when the elders in my congregation in Warwick called me in and asked if I had ever considered reaching out for greater responsibility. I took this as a spiritual compliment of the highest order. I was eventually appointed as a ministerial servant, responsible for managing the literature counter, counting attendance, and occasionally giving short talks from the platform. The appointment meant everything to me. It was a recognition, a confirmation that I was seen by the organization and by extension by Jehovah as trustworthy and worthy. Over the next 30 years, I served in that capacity without being elevated to elder. I was passed over at least a dozen times that I was aware of. No one ever explained why officially, but the social texture of those situations was unmistakable. There were quiet conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, recommendations that clearly went somewhere and died. I attributed it to my own spiritual shortcomings. I prayed about it. I fasted about it. I asked Jehovah what I was doing wrong. The thought that the process itself might be flawed, political, human rather than divinely guided, that thought I put down every time it rose. The doctrinal adjustments were harder to absorb as I aged. The organization referred to these adjustments as new light, an idea based on a scripture in Proverbs about the path of the righteous growing brighter. When a teaching changed, it was not described as a correction of an error, but as an increase in spiritual understanding. The generation doctrine was the one that hit me hardest.
For decades, we had been taught that the generation that saw the events of 1914 would not pass away before Armageddon came. This was a cornerstone doctrine. I had built my entire life around a compressed timeline. When the brothers who had lived through 1914 began dying of old age in the 1990s, the doctrine shifted, and then it shifted again. By the time I was in my late 50s, the generation teaching had been redefined so many times that it bore almost no resemblance to what I had been taught as a child. The overlapping generations concept, the idea that one anointed person could have known another anointed person, and together they constituted the generation of 1914, stretched the timeline indefinitely in a way that struck me, privately, as an organizational contortion rather than a spiritual illumination. I held that thought for a moment, recognized it as dangerous, and filed it away. I remember sitting in the Kingdom Hall the Sunday that a new understanding of the generation was announced from the platform. The elder reading it stumbled slightly over the words. I watched the faces of the people around me. Some were nodding with the quiet confidence of those who never question. Some had the careful blankness I recognized as the expression you wear when you are processing something that doesn't quite fit. I wore that expression too. I went home and I sat with it, and by the evening I had filed it away into the same mental drawer where I kept all the other things that did not quite fit.
Connie found out what I was researching on a Tuesday evening in February when she came home early from a sisters group meeting and found me at the kitchen table with the laptop open and a legal document on the screen. I did not try to close it. I had been carrying this alone for 4 months, and I was exhausted, and some part of me had been waiting for her to find out because I could not find the courage to begin that conversation myself. She sat down across from me and looked at the screen for a long moment. She had been in the truth since birth, like me. Her grandmother had been a pioneer. Her parents had named her after a verse in Proverbs. Her entire sense of self, of who she was as a woman, a wife, a mother, a person of worth, was built inside that organization. I knew that. I sat there and I watched her read a paragraph from a court transcript, and I felt the specific grief of a man who is about to ask someone he loves to look at something that cannot be unseen. She did not react the way I feared she would. She did not stand up and accuse me of apostasy or threaten to call the elders. She sat very still, and she asked me how long I had known. I told her everything: the handbook, the research, the weeks of sleepless nights, the court records. I told her without rehearsal, without the careful framings I had spent months constructing in my head. It came out rough and honest, and when I finished, the kitchen was completely silent. Her first response was to defend the organization, which I had expected. She said that these were individual failures, that imperfect men made mistakes, that the organization could not be responsible for every decision made by every elder in every congregation worldwide. I had made every one of these arguments to myself in the early weeks. I listened to her, and I did not argue because I understood that she needed to go through those arguments herself. You cannot shortcut someone else's process. But I told her about the handbook paragraph. I told her the specific instruction: call the legal department before involving secular authorities. She was quiet for a long time after that. She asked me if I was sure about what it said. I told her I had read it 3 times and that I could tell her exactly where it was in the text. She nodded slowly, and I watched something change in her face, and I knew that she was beginning the same journey I had been on for months, except that she was starting it with me beside her instead of alone. The weeks that followed were the most painful of our marriage. Connie oscillated. There were days when she was ready to stop attending meetings with me, and days when she drove herself to the Kingdom Hall and came home quieter than usual, unable to explain whether she had found comfort or just familiar routine. I never pressured her. I had spent enough time inside the organization to understand that pressure only produces compliance, and compliance is not the same as genuine change. The elders noticed our reduced attendance.
One of them, an elder I had known for 20 years, a man who had given the talk at my mother's funeral, came to our house with another brother for what the organization calls a shepherding call. These visits are pastoral in framing. They bring scriptures and concern, they ask how you are and whether there is anything troubling your spiritual state. And the question is genuine, but it is also, in the organizational context, an assessment visit. They need to know what is wrong with you so they can determine whether you are a problem. I told them I was having personal difficulties of a spiritual nature and that I appreciated their visit. I offered them tea. The elder who had spoken at my mother's funeral told me that Jehovah loved me and that the congregation was my family and that whatever I was going through, I did not have to go through it alone. He put his hand on my shoulder when he said it. He meant it. I'm sure he meant it. And that made it harder, not easier, because the people inside that organization are not generally cynical operatives. They are sincere, believing people who have also been shaped by the same system, and their love is real, even when it is deployed in service of an institution that does not deserve it. After they left, I sat with what I was about to lose. I had friends in the congregation I had known for 3 and 4 decades, men I had preached alongside in the cold, women who had brought food to our door when Connie was ill, a community that had been present at every significant moment of my adult life. The disfellowshipping policy, the organizational practice of requiring all members to shun anyone who leaves or is removed, meant that if I formally disassociated myself, every one of those people would be required to cut contact with me. Not out of cruelty, out of obedience. That is the architecture. The threat of losing your entire social world is the mechanism that keeps people inside. I did not leave because I was angry. I want to make sure that is clear. I left because I could no longer sit in a building that I now knew had systematically protected abusers, had instructed its representatives to prioritize legal liability over child safety, and had done so not through the failures of individual men, but through written organizational policy. I could not sing the kingdom songs and raise my hand and answer the questions from the watchtower and call it worship. Not anymore. Leaving took longer than the decision. The decision happened in my kitchen in February. The actual process of stepping away, of attending fewer meetings, then no meetings, of writing the letter to the body of elders that formally notified them of my disassociation, that process took most of a year. Connie and I moved together through it, not in perfect synchrony, but in the same direction, which was more than I had dared to hope for in the early months. The letter I wrote to the elders was 3 paragraphs long. I had drafted it 7 times. The earlier drafts were long and detailed and full of documentation, the handbook, the court cases, the policy analysis. I threw them all away. The final version said simply that I had concluded after thorough examination that I could no longer in good conscience continue as a member of the congregation, and that I wished my fellow members no harm and held them in genuine affection. I signed it with my full name, and I walked it to the Kingdom Hall letterbox on a Thursday afternoon, and I stood outside that building for a moment. The wall at the side, the one I had painted at 13, standing on a scaffold in October drizzle, had been repainted since then, of course. White now, with the congregation's name in blue letters. I stood and looked at it, and I did not feel triumph or vindication. I felt grief, which is the correct feeling, because something was ending that mattered to me, even if it had also harmed me. Within 2 weeks of the letter, the withdrawals began. A brother I had known since 1987, a man who had helped me move house twice, who had come to my father's bedside with me, sent me a text message that said he had heard the news and wanted me to know he was praying for me. That was the last communication I received from him. Another friend, a man who had pioneered alongside me for 2 years, crossed the street rather than walk past me in town. He did not cross aggressively, he crossed preemptively, with the rehearsed naturalness of someone who knew the protocol for years and had hoped never to have to use it. My son took it harder than I had expected. He called me the evening the announcement was made from the platform, the brief, anonymous announcement the organization uses to notify congregations that a member has disassociated, with no detail given, just the name and the fact.
He was crying. He told me he did not understand. He told me he loved me. He told me that the elders had told him he could still speak to me, which was technically true in the case of close family members, though the organization's guidance makes it clear that such contact should be limited and spiritually purposeful. I told him I loved him too, and that my door was always open, and that I was not going anywhere. The silence that followed in my daily life was physical. No more Saturday mornings organizing for field service, no more Tuesday evening book study, no more district assemblies and hired sports arenas, no more green lanyards, no more counting the hours. My weeks were suddenly full of empty time, and the first months I did not know what to do with it. I had structured my entire life around congregational activities for 53 years. The absence of that structure was not peace, it was disorientation. But I read voraciously and without the filter of organizational approval for the first time in my life. I read church history, comparative religion, psychology of high control groups. I read Bonhoeffer and C.S. Lewis and Bart Ehrman, and I read them with the same intensity I had once reserved for the Watchtower publications, except that now I was reading to understand rather than to confirm. The difference was extraordinary. I had not realized how small my intellectual world had been until I began to see what existed outside it. I found a therapist, something I would never have done as a witness, because the organization discouraged psychological counseling that was not grounded in biblical principles. She was a woman in her 50s who specialized in religious trauma. I had not heard the term religious trauma before I found her. I had not known there was a name for what I was describing. When she used the term cult to describe the organizational structure I had been part of, I flinched, not because I disagreed, but because the word felt violent, and I was not ready for the thing I loved to be called by its most accurate name. Connie and I are still together. She left several months after I did, arriving at her own conclusions through her own research and her own conversations with people she had known inside the organization who had also left. We do not agree on everything we have concluded from this experience. She is more forgiving of the ordinary members than I sometimes am. I am more forgiving of the institution than she sometimes is. We are both still working out what we believe about God, which is a conversation we had never been allowed to have freely before, and which is now the most interesting